have sex while you have a vaginal yeast infection? Also, can you transmit a vaginal yeast infection to your partner? And are yeast infections sexually transmitted diseases? I'm answering these questions, guys. I'm Dr. Jen. It's good to see you. All right, let's start with the bigger question of, can you have sex while you have a vaginal yeast infection? I'm going to give you the answer at the end, but I'm going to tell you some points now that I think you need to consider. Number one, we know that vaginal yeast infections can be very uncomfortable in and of themselves. Your vulva or external genitalia often gets swollen, it's red, it's inflamed, it's irritated, it burns, it hurts, and not only does it burn and hurt, but it can get much worse with sexual activity. So having sex while you have a vaginal yeast infection very likely may cause you greater pain. The other thing is with vaginal yeast infections, the area, the external genitalia often gets very itchy. And with scratching and irritation, that can cause micro tears in the skin, the very delicate skin of the external genitalia, like the vulva, the lips, etc. That then could predispose you to viruses, bacteria, and sexually transmitted diseases if you were to come across them, potentially putting yourself at risk. The third thing you need to keep in mind is that we know how uncomfortable it is to have a vaginal yeast infection already. And by the way, I have a video on vaginal yeast infections, the symptoms, the diagnosis, the treatment. I'll make sure I link that here. But this is the thing. If you're having sexual intercourse or sexual activity, it very likely is going to create friction or cause friction in your external genitalia area. And that could be even more irritating and potentially delay your healing. You want to give your body the best chance to heal, and sexual activity may not be that for you. The next thing I want to mention before I get into whether a yeast infection is a sexually transmitted disease and before I get into whether you can transmit a yeast infection is that some treatments for yeast infections, especially some of the topical treatments like the ones that you insert, they may contain ingredients that could be damaging to latex condoms, potentially putting you at risk if you were to use a condom. If the condom is damaged, it may not protect you the way you want it to, so keep that in mind. All right. Now, let's go on to the other topic. And by the way, I'm going to give you my verdict as to whether you should have sex or can have sex while you have a yeast infection, so don't go anywhere. But let's talk about whether a vaginal yeast infection is a sexually transmitted infection. That answer is no. It is not an STD or an STI. Why? Because you can get yeast infections without having sex. And it's possible to get yeast infections even if you've never had sex, even though it's more likely and more common in women who have had sex. So yeast infections are not sexually transmitted diseases. However, that leads me to our next point. It is possible to give your partner a yeast infection. That's right. 15% of men will get an itchy rash on their penis after unprotected sex with a partner who has a vaginal yeast infection. Okay? So even though, and I'll say this again, vaginal yeast infections are not sexually transmitted because you can get them without sex. Okay? You can get them all by yourself from other risk factors, etc. But you can spread it to your partner. It's also another reason why having sex when you have a vaginal yeast infection can be very risky. Keep in mind that dental dams and condoms can reduce the risk of spreading yeast to your partner. And in some cases, if your partner does get a yeast infection, they will need to be treated as well. So what's the conclusion here? Can you have sex even if you have a yeast infection? Well, technically you can. The question is whether you should and whether it's in you and your partner's best interest. Okay. Remember, it can delay healing, your healing. It can interfere with condoms. It can cause you extreme pain. It can be very uncomfortable. It could potentially spread a yeast infection to your partner. There are plenty of reasons not to have sex while you have a vaginal yeast infection. My recommendation is to make sure that you are completely healed. If you choose to have sex while you have a yeast infection, understand that barrier methods can be helpful and potentially reduce the risk, but also you have to have an open and honest conversation with your partner to discuss the risks, etc. So guys, I hope this is helpful. Please subscribe to my channel on YouTube. Follow me on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, all the good stuff. Please subscribe to my daily health newsletter at drjencottle.com. Please remember also that yeast infections are treatable. Your doctor, if you think you have a yeast infection, I recommend you talking to your doctor so that they can diagnose you properly and give you treatment. All right, guys, take care.